Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm a PhD student in microbiology here at the University of Glasgow, and I will be one of the chairs for tonight. For those of you who are new to BioLit Talks, it is a project led mostly by doctoral students here at the University of Glasgow. We also have a master's student among us, and we host interdisciplinary discussions in which we bring together scientists, academics in the humanities, and artists to talk about their perspective on a common theme. And by so doing, we hope to reshape some of our understanding and the way we look at things. And we've been running our events since 2021. We have ran events on infectious diseases, on the gut, and this year our overarching topic is death. So we started with a workshop in October, a breathing workshop that had the purpose of kind of reconnecting us to the awareness of being alive. And then we hosted an event at the beginning of November looking at the ways that we imagine and understand death. And for those of you who maybe missed it, it is now recorded and uploaded. And today, instead, we'll be talking about the social experience of death. We briefly touched upon it in our last event. Today, we'll be delving deeper. And we'll be talking about the ways in which maybe, as a society, we shape death and we influence it. And I'm happy to start. Rachel, do you have any comments?
So just to inform you, please, we're having a recording on today, so most of you will not be there in the recording, but the first two benches are, like the first two rows are being recorded. So if you would prefer not to be recorded,
run away now.
not the first two rows, I think maybe just a couple of chairs in front.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, bye-bye. Just also a small reminder that because we are recording, if you can kindly keep your phones on silent, just so that it doesn't interrupt our session. And as always, if you're not comfortable with your voice being recorded while we take questions, please make a note of it, and I'll be more than happy to read it out for you. Okay, so can we do it?
Yeah, and I'll hand it over to our speakers to introduce themselves.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good to see everybody. Number of people in the room gives evidence to my belief that death has never been more popular. So here we are. I'm Michael Cholbi. I'm a professor and distinguished chair of practical ethics at the University of Edinburgh. I'm a philosopher who writes on a number of issues related to death and mortality. Some of these include suicide-assisted dying, grief, capital punishment, our attitudes toward death, fear, and otherwise. And I am the sort of founder and global coordinator of the International Association for the Philosophy of Death.
Okay. My name is Nathan Woodling, and I'm a lecturer here at the University of Glasgow. I started my lab and my research group here in Glasgow about a year ago. And I'm a biogerontologist, so that's a biologist who studies the biology of aging and ultimately death. So my lab really tries to understand the genes and basic biological processes that control aging. And because we want to study that relatively quickly, we do it in an animal that ages really quickly, the fruit fly. And amazingly, the genes that seem to contribute to aging and ultimately dying in fruit flies seem to be the same ones that do that in mice, and we think in humans as well. So most of my days are spent looking at flies in the lab and actually counting how many have died. So to me, death is data, and that is what I spend a lot of my days doing. So I come at this from a quite different perspective, but hopefully that gives us a lot of ground to work from.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Thank you both. I think maybe a good starting point would be kind of what brought us to choose to have this as an overarching topic for this event, the social experience of death, is the fact that as a society, there are many ways in which we perhaps try to delay death and hinder death. And an obvious example that comes to mind is maybe all the research that's going into aging. But there are other ways in which perhaps we don't give it an obstacle, right? I'm thinking maybe of like, I don't know, gun laws or things like that. So, but there's obviously nuances. And yeah, I was wondering a bit, what are your thoughts on the ways in which maybe as a society we are facilitating that and the ways in which we're challenging it?
Well, facilitating and challenging. Well, certainly the UK is not unusual among industrialized nations in spending a fair amount of its medical resources on the last sort of phase of people's lives. The typical person, about 1/3 of every bit of money, right, that will be spent on your medical care will be spent on the last 6 months of your life. So a good bit of effort, I suppose, is put into either, depending on your point of view, keeping people alive or extending the dying process, sort of making possible for dying to take place a bit more slowly. At the same time, of course, we're normal in that we tend, I suppose, to look at different risks to human life in reference to what strikes us as normal or typical, right? So, seems to me the classic example of this is the automobile. Right? The automobile is a pretty dangerous technology. It kills lots of people and contributes, of course, to climate change, which probably causes a lot of damage to human health too. But of course, we've grown accustomed to it, reliant upon that technology. So, hardly anybody, is crying out for getting rid of cars or something like that on the grounds that it is a very dangerous technology. It is. So, I think we bring to our ways of relating to death and dying. There's kind of cultural expectations about what sorts of things are typical and atypical. And I do think it's a relatively recent development, like let's say last half century, that so much money, energy, time is put into, right, the sort of final phase of people's lives as sort of aging takes over and leads to death.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to start from, is thinking about that end of life morbidity that is such a big challenge for our healthcare systems today. Even in the past 30 years, in which my field has been growing in understanding aging, it has shifted from when it started, where scientists were really excited that they could double the lifespan of a worm or increase the lifespan of a fly by just tweaking one gene, to now really thinking about, what does that actually mean, that we're just increasing lifespan? Is that really what we want to do if we're thinking about understanding aging and making a difference in medicine? And the answer is probably not. We don't just want to extend lifespan. Really what we want to do is compress that end of life morbidity so that people can be healthier up until the point where we ultimately die of old age, whatever that is. And most researchers in my field, when they talk about this, say that when they think about how they want to die, they want to live a life of relative health until an old age, whatever they define that to be, and then die peacefully in their sleep. I think that is what a lot of us in this room would also hope for. There are, of course, some people in my field who are thinking about living longer or even ultimately living forever, but I think those are the outliers. But it might be something interesting we can pick up on later. But really, that end of life cost, where those final years are so expensive to your own health and to society, is something that's so important today.
Well, I would add that there's the question of the extension of lifespan, but it seems to me, like what you're saying, that we probably want the extension of what we might call health span, right? Sort of, the period of our lives where it seems like we're healthy enough to enjoy the various benefits that living affords us. And one of the things that seems clear from, everything we know about kind of demographics of aging and dying is that, we do enjoy longer lives than we did in the past, but proportionally, right, more of those lives are spent in this kind of late life decline phase, which is a relatively new part of the human experience. Our predecessors, Victorian era, 150 years ago, generally speaking, death came pretty quickly. Right? People died of things that killed them relatively quickly, whereas, upwards of 80% of deaths now, right, are due to chronic illnesses, right? So, I think the NHS has said that the median time between a person's death and the diagnosis of the condition that kills them is something like 2.7 years now, right? So that means that, there's this period of our lives where we're typically, right, we're sort of suffering, right, from whatever ailment will probably cause our deaths. These are, as we all know, kind of nasty, unpleasant diseases, cancer and organ failure. So it's a new part of human experience, I think, relatively speaking.
Yeah, it's something that's been uncovered as we've managed to deal with more infectious diseases and other causes of death. Lifespan has increased, but then a lot of the diseases for which age is the primary risk factor, Alzheimer's, cancers, heart disease, are now rising in prevalence, largely just because we are living longer. So longer life means now living with these chronic diseases, and having more than one of them at once. Multimorbidity is now a major challenge.
But if you get out of childhood, and almost everyone does get out of childhood in industrialized countries, we're in pretty good shape, right? We'll probably make it to 65 or better I mean, for any women in the room, the good news is you're not as likely to die of childbirth.
Yeah.
100 years ago, right, where childbirth was the number one killer of women, right? So that's a major shift, right, in kind of what death looks like. So
Yeah, I was looking at some statistics today to prepare for this and looking at the difference between men and women in life expectancy. And if you look historically, it goes through some really big changes depending on whether there were major wars going on. And just looking at what was killing men versus killing women in Europe during the 1910s ended up with a lot of that death being very dependent on whether you were a man or a woman. Nowadays, it's much more similar. There are differences in disease prevalence, but maybe that means death is a more universal experience now.
Equality. Gender equality.
Perhaps.
I mean, definitely not quite yet. But gender equality.
With respect to death.
With respect to death, perhaps. But even nowadays, a lot of the statistics are maybe skewed by the fact that still nowadays men tend to do a lot of manual labor, and that can predispose to more accidents. And that's one of the reasons why men are still considered to have maybe everywhere I expect to be. I don't know if there's also maybe a biological foundation to that as well.
Yeah, there's definitely a biological foundation to the difference in mortality between males and females in a variety of different animals. Usually in animals that have similar genetics to us, it's the females that live longer than the males. Still don't really understand fundamentally why. There's a lot of good research going on to figure out whether having 2 X chromosomes is better than having just 1 X chromosome. Maybe you're at more risk with just 1 X chromosome of having a faulty gene on that single X chromosome that leads to a shorter lifespan. But amazingly, through all the research, there's just not one consensus on why that is. But there's certainly a genetic component that goes beyond different job classes, different environmental factors as well.
And for men, it's violence.
Yeah.
Human men, right?
Yeah.
Violence is a very big factor, right?
Yep.
The probability of your dying due to violence is much greater than men. So
Actually, based on violence and the fact that before, Nathan, you had mentioned a lot of my colleagues think like the ideal thing is to die in your sleep, right? And I think when it comes to death, we have a lot of, we kind of give it a correctness, or like we think of some deaths as being right deaths, some deaths as being like bad deaths, where right deaths are really associated maybe to like longevity and health and company, and like we think that a bad death is one that is violent or follows disease. And yeah, what are your thoughts on like this morality, this correctness that we attribute to death, and also this idea of like a natural death? What is a natural death? And nowadays, what do we define as natural death in today's context?
Yeah, even in a really simple system like fruit flies, this is still something we struggle with. The question of what does a healthy, long-lived fly die of is not one that we really know. It's easy to look at a fly that gets infected early in life and say, okay, here's this bacterium, this is why this fly died. But usually in people who are studying aging, we color it with that same societal expectation that there is a correct death or a right death, and that's what we want to study. We want to study those healthy, long-lived flies that go through their lifespan without having an injury or infection or something else, and that's really what we care about in terms of thinking about dying of old age, whatever that means. But I don't think we have a satisfactory definition of what that actually is, what dying of old age means. And yeah, what does any animal, what does any human die of? Sometimes we know, sometimes it's a combination of factors.
I think a good place to start is with perhaps the distinction between dying and death, right? So the question of what makes for a good dying, right? I think that question is now answered very differently probably than it was in the past. Again, thinking about North American, Euro-American cultures 100 years ago, there was a pretty clear idea of what dying well would amount to, right? Prevailing belief system was Christian. Dying was the preparation for the afterlife. The point of your relatives assembling around you as you die is to pray for you or to give you the sort of strength or grace, what have you, to meet your maker. Funerals were oriented toward the fate of the person who had died, presumed fate of the person who's now in the afterlife. And of course, that belief system still exists, but it seems to me that people's conception of what makes for a good dying now, it's a much more kind of interpersonal or social sort of thing that they want to die in their homes and familiar surroundings, with their friends and loved ones, with some measure of lucidity or awareness of their situation, but not too much pain and that sort of thing. So I think that's, where we stand roughly on sort of what good dying is. The philosophical question about what is good or bad about death is a different question, right? There we're asking the question about, not about the process of dying, but the fact of death itself. And there, historically, there are, I suppose, a couple of positions, right, that philosophers have taken, one of which is that dying is not bad for us at all. It's not a harm or a benefit. That's famously associated with, Epicurean philosophers. And then more in the 20th century, I suppose, the prevailing view has been that a person's death could be bad for them, depending upon when it occurs. So the rough idea would be that if you die at a given time, that means that you didn't survive longer. And maybe in some cases, had you survived longer, you would have had a longer and better life, in which case your dying at that time was actually bad for you, right? Barred, right, from having a longer and better life. So I think it's important to kind of keep those two facets of the issue separate, right? Because the question of sort of what good dying is, as opposed to whether death is good or bad, striking is important.
Yeah, and trying to ascribe value to an amount of time in life versus if that time is going to be spent where you can be interacting with your loved ones and really experiencing what you want to experience versus the dying phase.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, value. Personally, I think it has to be more than just amount of time until death. It's the quality of that time as well. And hopefully that's the way that medicine and biomedicine are moving in my own field. But it's been a slow trek to get there. There's still a lot of, it's easy to look at a medication or a treatment and say this will improve the survival for somebody who has cancer by 6 months. Therefore, that's a great thing. But what do those 6 months look like? And that's a lot harder to quantify, so it's a lot harder to put that into an outcome of a clinical trial unless you have clear indicators of what that means. So I think we are improving on thinking about quality as well as just quantity.
I mean, I guess it also begs the question, if nowadays, a proportion, we spend bigger percentage of our lives suffering because of old age, is then the most ethical thing to do from a healthcare perspective, that of like prolonging life?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we're kind of two minds here, right? On the one hand, I think one of the reasons why most societies do tend to think of that last phase of life, sort of the final phase where, most cases nowadays people are kind of in decline health-wise. I think they think of it as important because human beings have a conception of themselves in time, and there are certain kinds of points in our lives that we think of as sort of more momentous, right, more significant to how our lives go than others, right? And of course, one phase that you're going to think is particularly important is the last phase, right? Endings seem to matter a lot to us, right? And that's understandable, right? Endings sort of put the period at the end of the proverbial biographical sentence. And so it's understandable that we want to give people a worthwhile and desirable final phase of their life. That said, the relationship between its being worthwhile and its being desirable and its being, if you will, medicalized, right? In most cases, that is to say, people's dying in the context of, being subject to various kinds of medical interventions. I think there's definitely a question to be asked about whether or not the medicalization of dying makes dying worse, right? I think most of us don't desire, right, for the final phase of our lives to be dominated by being a patient, right, and to the exclusion of all else, right? And that I think is something that many people are hoping to avoid, right, in the dying process.
Yeah, I completely echo everything that you said there. That we do need to consider how important the endings are, but then balance that with everything else that's a part of it. So yeah, we have a ways to go, but I think we're speaking the same language here at least.
Yeah, and I mean, people of course get nervous when we talk about healthcare expenditures and the costs of different sorts of things, and I think we're right to be nervous about that. it's a dicey and difficult subject. But I do think we should think about whether it makes sense for us to spend the amount of resources that we do. This isn't to say that we shouldn't be spending what we are spending, but we at least should be cognizant of what we're spending and ask ourselves whether we think it's a wise way for a society to allocate its scarce, financial and medical resources. Given that there's difficulties accessing healthcare, for people at various points in their lives, you might ask, are we overemphasizing, right, the very sort of last phase of people's lives at the expense of other phases that also could be associated with health-related challenges too. So I'm not, certainly not in a position to give any kind of glib, easy answer to these sorts of things. But at the same time, right, it does seem to be that they're the kinds of questions that a reasonable society asks itself about, how much it thinks that those final weeks, months, years of people's lives matter, right, to the quality or significance of their lives, and whether we should be allocating as much as we do.
This may be an unfair question, but so feel free to not say anything. But given that we were chatting earlier and realized that we're both originally from the US and have moved over to Scotland, have you seen any difference in how that end-of-life care is approached in countries with a privatized health system versus public health system?
Yeah. Well, so I think one thing that's clearly different about largely private provided healthcare as it is in the United States versus largely publicly provided healthcare as it is here, is that the mindset of clinicians and the mindsets of patients are different, right? So those of you who are UK natives and so forth, you've been largely acculturated, I think, to think of healthcare as something that communities provide to communities, roughly, right? It's not so much a private transaction between you and your doctor, right? It's not so much organized around the idea that I, as patient, and this person as clinician, are sort of collaborating in the provision of my care. And I think there's more, in some sense, openness around just the sorts of questions I was asking a minute ago about, whether or not I, as an individual, am entitled, right, to as much of my community's resources as I could conceivably be provided. In the US, where kind of the mindset is, that care is mostly given by private providers, that sort of contextual question is often not asked, right? Because it's just sort of me and this doctor, me and this hospital, right? How much, am I willing to pay him or her, or how much is my insurance company willing to pay him or her for this care? It's not sort of put in the context of how much is everybody else willing to, pay for this care. Right? So I think that's a different, and I would argue maybe healthier mindset. So.
Well, I was going to talk about a little bit about how you said about when you're at the end of your life, and then it becomes a matter of whether you want to be treated as a patient for the remaining time between your diagnosis and actual death, or even if it's a natural death. And then we spoke about this whole idea about private versus public medical or healthcare. Do you think by excluding, or would in the event that we do exclude certain groups of people from access to healthcare just because they're in the dying phase, that would contribute to a social death where we're treating them as though they're already dead instead of looking at it from a perspective that they still may live for the good or bad?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what I would say about whether we're treating them as if they're already dead. I'm not sure if that's exactly the way I would see things. I think one thing that seems true about what people want from the end phase of their lives, and I'm thinking, of how that's experienced here and now in advanced industrial cultures, is that people want to be acknowledged as dying. Right. I actually think this is sort of an important thing that people kind of yearn for, that they don't want to be treated by the world as if, right, they're not in fact dying. So, the great literary example of this is The Death of Ivan Ilyich, right? So, if you've read that little novella, if you haven't read it, why haven't you? But, a little 100-page, kind of chronicle, right, of a man who's facing death, but nobody will tell him he is. And this is, of course, deeply frustrating to him. So I think, we really do want to be acknowledged as dying, but on the other hand, I also don't think people want to be reduced, right, to being a dying person. right? They don't want every sort of interaction, every gesture that they encounter day to day to be about the fact, right, that they're dying, right? So, in terms of individuals who sort of fall through the cracks of like medical attention, medical institutions, I guess I would say there's something of an injustice there, not only kind of from a healthcare perspective, but sort of from the standpoint of social recognition, right? I mean, I think when we think about the sadness or poignancy of people kind of dying alone and anonymously, I think part of that sadness and poignancy comes from the fact that I think people do want to be acknowledged as dying. That doesn't strike me as a strange thing at all, even if sometimes it's hard for them to. They're dying. But once they have admitted it, I think they want the rest of the world to be in on the secret.
I think we also need to think about when we're thinking about treatments and healthcare provision for people who are going through the end of their lives or are actually dying. That doesn't just mean drugs and medicines and things that are extremely costly. It also includes how people are treated socially, how people are addressed day to day by other people. And there's a value to that in addition to the really expensive drug-based medical care. So giving value to people during their dying days doesn't just mean giving them treatments that will give them an additional however many weeks. So I think it's important to acknowledge that as well, and as you said, the social aspect of thinking about dying.
Right. Try something to generalize what you were suggesting. Maybe the question should be reframed as not just being recognized as dying, but as having a period where you and perhaps relatives are reconciled to that. Because I think being snatched away, relatives are much more pained if they weren't expecting it than not. On the other hand, I saw sometime in the last 10 years a very interesting program which collected people who just had a terminal diagnosis and knew they were going to die in about 12 months. And it brought these together as a focus group at several points. And one of the interesting things that came out of that was how, well, first of all, how different they were, but more how often a couple, one of whom was going to die, was in denial about it and the other wasn't. They were trying to make rational decisions, and that wasn't predicted by it was a dying person. Sometimes you see the dying person not want the husband to go mad and do displacement activities, but make crucial financial decisions. But sometimes it was the other way around. And that would be consistent with this reframing in terms of becoming reconciled during that period.
Yes, I do think that when we look at the empirical work sort of on end of life, one very prominent theme in that research is again that people want to be recognized as dying, but they don't want this to be the sole defining feature of how people relate to them, right? But of course, death denial is a very powerful motivator in human affairs. Some of you may have heard of the body of thought known as terror management theory. These are some psychologists who have investigated sort of how we relate to death, and essentially their claim is that so many human motivations are oriented around anxiety concerning death, trying to avoid anxiety concerning death. These theorists think that sort of human civilization is, in some sense, one big long effort to try to avoid death or manage the fact of death. But yes, I mean, the relatives in particular, right? There's great frustration, I suspect, when someone has come to terms with the fact that their death is relatively imminent, and others won't do the same, right? And Ivan Ilyich is in this situation, right? The poor fellow, has this a wound in his side, and then suddenly his health starts declining, and nobody understands what's going on, and he understands what's going on, but no one will say it to his face. You're a dying man, and that's I suppose a sort of painful second in some sense, right? To leave the world, in some ways kind of alienated, right, from others because others won't acknowledge or accommodate, right, your reality.
I think it's interesting that you're talking about this particularly human negative perception of death, but I think it's actually more biologically universal. There's some really interesting work that even in fruit flies can sense other fruit flies that are dead and avoid them. And not only that, but then those fruit flies that have seen the dead flies become aversive to other flies, and they don't like being around them. And there's been this incredible amount of work done on this to figure out how this actually happens. And it turns out that it's actually vision and sight that flies need. They see another dead fly, and that makes them have this entire reaction where they try to get away from it, they don't like it, and they actually have a shorter lifespan themselves.
Terror.
It's bad for them. It's terror, it's death terror, but it's at a fundamental biological level that is there through animals that are so distantly related to us evolutionarily, and yet it's so fundamental to being alive as an animal and being mortal and seeing that other animals are dying around you. So it may be that this is something so much more basic than what a human brain requires.
That's so fascinating. I feel like what you said just now really makes me kind of think of the idea of survival, right? And that maybe biologically we're programmed, I don't like using the word programmed too much, but biologically we're programmed to do it. And also compared to other species, I think, I don't know, what kind of does survival mean to us today, and in what ways are we surviving? Because obviously this will depend on, where you geographically are and the social class you're part of and all these kind of questions. But yeah, this idea of like how nowadays is survival still something we can talk about, and what are the ways in which we're surviving?
Survival. It's an interesting one.
Well, I mean, I guess, in terms of thinking about the human relationship toward death, I don't think we should draw inordinately sharp contrasts, perhaps, between ourselves and other animals. I mean, certainly, primates have death-related behaviors, that are pretty obvious and evident. But I do think probably that there are features of the human relationship to death that are distinctly human because of sort of, things that we can entertain thanks to, the big amount of gray matter between our ears, right? So, what are human beings, I suppose, good at or sort of distinctive? How are we distinctive? Well, it seems to me one of the ways in which we're distinctive is we're really good at entertaining counterfactuals, right? How can the world go? How could the world go? We can imagine, right, possibilities, right, in a way that I suspect probably other animals aren't as capable, right? And of course, that then, enables us to think about death because, we come to appreciate fairly early in life, all the educational researchers say at least, that by the age of 3, people grasp the concept of death, right? That death is kind of permanent non-existence, not sort of temporary non-existence. But of course, in grasping that permanence, that sort of goes alongside with grasping, well, things could be different, right? Someone could live longer, right? They could have a longer or shorter life. And of course, our relationship to time seems distinctive, right? Every creature exists in time, but we seem to be perhaps distinctive in, having a kind of awareness of its passage and having a sense of ourselves in relationship to past and future, right? So I think, death weighs on us, right, in a way that, it probably can't weigh on other animals, which doesn't say it doesn't weigh on them at all, but it probably doesn't weigh on them in quite the sort of conscious manner, right, that it probably weighs on us, right? But in terms of survival, right, I mean, I take it that survival is always a kind of time index notion, right? You survive past some certain point in time. So that, in that sense, I don't think it's like exceptionally difficult, right, to get at the notion of survival. But of course, surviving and thriving.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the data that I spend my time with day in and day out is the probability of survival. Just for a whole population of animals, what's the probability that they will survive to this age, this age? But again, as you said, that does not mean thriving. That doesn't mean health. That doesn't mean are they functioning well. So survival is a fairly simple concept, but it really doesn't capture a life.
Yeah, for sure. I think I didn't explain my question very well. It was more like in this, kind of a privileged society where we're no longer maybe struggling for food, we're not struggling for housing or shelter or warmth. What do our survival instincts kind of like translate into? But
competition with others.
Yeah, maybe like anxiety about career or something like that.
That's my guess, right? Is that probably the best evolutionary psychological story here is that we sort of redirect various kinds of instincts that we have related to survival into, various kinds of competitive instincts that we have that are related probably to the survival of those who are near and dear to us. We compete against one another to sort of ensure that, those within our in-group are secure, right? Those within our communities are secure, even perhaps at the expense of those outside of our communities or our tribes. So that's probably part of what we're doing with our survival instincts, kind of redirecting it in a kind of intersocial way.
Yeah, and I would imagine that the same emotional responses that evolved to deal with imminent threats to life still react to threats to health, to mental health, to seeing a loved one who's in danger of something that's not necessarily life-threatening, but still prompts those same emotional responses that evolved to deal with that in the first place. So
Or
I
to
think
unfamiliar people in your environment.
well, yes, that too. Yeah, indeed.
Sorry, I'm going to get you back to what you were saying about death denial and terror management theory. So, you know how we actively avoid talking about death or the process of dying, or just denying this possibility that we're eventually going to die. Do you think that these are, not do you think, what kinds of taboos influence our, denial of death? Because some cultures definitely promote the speaking of death and the end of life passage, whereas others or people tend to stigmatize some of the feelings and interpretations towards death. So how does this influence the way we see death or dying or connecting with people who are dying or death?
Can we talk about pornography? One of my favorite essays about death was published in the 1950s by a scholar named Jeffrey Gorer. I think he was an art historian, so I think the essay is kind of a one-off thing, actually. But the title of the essay is The Pornography of Death. And I've taught philosophy of death and dying for almost a quarter century now. And it's definitely one of the essays that gets my students' wheels churning, wheels spinning. And the thesis of Gorer's essay, this was written in the 1950s, is that the people of his era have swapped places with, let's say, the Victorians of the late 19th century in the following way. The Victorians, right, were squeamish about sex, right? And they had sort of various kinds of ways of relating to it that were kind of, transgressive or racy, erotica and, literary pornography and that sort of thing, prostitution and this kind of stuff. But for various reasons, they weren't squeamish about death. There's children's literature from the Victorian era, right? where by children's, I don't mean like for adolescents, I mean for like 3-year-olds, somebody dies, and, this is like this little instruction manual on how to deal with, other people's death, directed at like, primary school kids, right? And of course, the Victorians had a different relationship to death because it was more frequent, right? People died, more frequently. They died at younger ages in some cases. They died more suddenly. And, there were sort of practices that perhaps are quite unfamiliar to us now, but were very prevalent then. Corpses were kept in your parlor, for a while after the person died. And, in many cases, the corpse would be buried on your own land or something like that. Comparing that to our experience of death, and what Gorer says is, yeah, we become less squeamish about sex than the Victorians, but we become more squeamish about death, right? Death is our pornography, right? And there's something to his, of course, he was writing in the 1950s, but I think there's something to this observation even now, right? I think most of the ways that people relate to death, in popular culture are focused on, I guess you'd sort of say the sensationalistic or most lurid aspects of it, right? And this in part, right, is because death and dying are phenomena that for us mostly happen in institutions, right, rather than in our domestic lives, right? They're not part of our day-to-day patterns of living, right? So, someone dies nowadays, we call a mortuarial scientist, right, to deal with the body, and then this goes to a hospital, and and then somebody handles it for a few days and so forth, right? So it's a much more technologized, expertise-driven, culture around death as compared to the Victorians, right? But when we relate to death, we relate to death, then I think through kind of cultural modalities that again kind of emphasize the lurid, our fascination with, serial killers and terrorism and all these sorts of things are really kind of fixations with, death in its kind of most, I don't know, violent, glittering forms, right? As one of my students pointed out the other day, there's all these, popular, serial killer podcasts, right? And he glibly said, but I thought it was very funny. He said, how come there are no podcasts about attempted murder? Right? The attempted murder podcast. Right? It's death itself, right? That's the allure here. So, I think Gore, though he was writing in the 50s, the thesis still sort of holds true, right? That our relationship to death is a sort of, quasi-pornographic one. It's this sort of, it's this almost shameful feature of human existence that we relate to not in a kind of candid or forthright way, but in this kind of lurid or sensationalistic way.
I think that's true even in biology and among biologists. I'm thinking of a particular scientist I knew in London who was really interested, he is interested in aging, but this particular set of projects was not about aging. It was about death and the process of death itself in different animals and understanding how animals die, what happens within that actual process of going from life to death. And it was really unpopular. It was really difficult for him to get funding for this, for him to end up publishing about it, talking about it, even though it was really interesting how an animal dies, how an animal goes from having all of these energy stores, all of this ability to make energy, to breathe, to then being an inanimate collection of carbon, basically. And biologically, I think it's a really important question. A lot of people just said, well, why are you studying death? Who cares about death? We're biologists, we care about life. So I think that taboo still stands, and it's something that biologically, it's biology. We should be, death is a part of it, though. And even though this was studies going on in little nematode worms where we could get really interesting information, he still faced a lot of pushback for it. So I think there is still that taboo about thinking about death. And just thinking about my own work, I don't spend a lot of time actually looking at death. I just look at living, already dead, has been for however long, and just mark it down as data and move on. But it is something that still holds a big taboo for us.
I think another thing that comes up with the sort of taboo fascination we have to death is we seem to place more value on some specific deaths, or there is more interest on some ways in which a death has occurred rather than other types of death. For example, you mentioned the true crime serial killer podcasts. We're a lot more interested in that one guy who killed his wife rather than maybe the thousands of people dying in a war scenario. So why do we tend to place more importance on some deaths over others? And also related to a biological context, why do we perhaps place more value on animals that are maybe larger or tend to live longer, which is probably coupled in biology, rather than, for example, a lot of the animals that we work on a lot as well in biological systems, obviously because they reproduce more quickly, but they also tend to be smaller. So yeah, where does that different attribution to the value of life and death come from?
Well, again, going back, to the idea that I think most contemporary cultures relate to death in this kind of like pornographic way, sensationalistic way. But I think this is a way for people to kind of relate to death, but not in a way that amounts to envisioning, right, their a death of the sort that they themselves are likely to face, right? So paradoxically, it's a kind of comfortable way, right, to think about death by thinking about serial killers and terrorism and so forth, because actually that's quite remote, right, as a possibility for your own death, right? So it's a kind of way to entertain the prospect of mortality without, if you will, getting too close to the bone, right? But I would say that, again, a powerful bit of evidence, right, for us having this kind of sensationalistic or pornographic relationship to death is that, there are very few media depictions of what for us are like ordinary, mundane human dying. If you're not a gerontologist or an oncologist or an ICU physician, you're likely to have very little, right, contact, right, with, ordinary, non-sensational, non-violent human death. I suppose that one of the things to say, right, is that there's also an element of this that I think is kind of wrapped up in, I don't know, culture of celebrity in some sense, right? I think we human beings are always attracted to stories, and of course, the deaths of people that we know through, celebrity culture in various ways are in some ways, akin to sort of deaths in our very extended families, right? So when Her Royal Highness died last year, I was on the phone, I think, for about 3 days straight talking to him, right, about grief and so on, right? Because of course, lots of people, knew this person, and she was sort of integrated into the lives of a lot of people. So, I think that prominent people, right, will always their deaths will always be in the spotlight to a greater degree.
And I think there's a certain scientific and human fascination with the extremes as well. Extreme ways of dying, but also extremes within biology. The things that really excite biologists are when we find a new species that lives so much longer than we expected. The naked mole rat that lives for 30 years when mice that are the same size as it live for 3 years. Why is that? On the flip side, there are some fish that have a really, really short lifespan, just for a few months. And scientists love those because they're a vertebrate, they're really close to us in terms of evolution, and yet we can study them in the lab because they have such a short lifespan and they age so quickly. So there's something about the extremes that become really attractive in trying to understand even biology.
Is it an interest in, for lack of a better word, freakishness?
I mean, I guess the idea is if we can it's easier to find out what the gene is that contributes to this extreme than it would be to figure out the difference between an animal that lives for 3 years and one that lives for 3.5 years. When you're looking at 3 years versus 30 years, then it's really easy to find that difference. But there is a certain aspect of freakishness as well. And certainly when somebody gets up at a conference and talks about this new species that lives for 200 years or something, everybody goes, oh, wow, that's great. It's really interesting. But I think it is because there's a greater chance of uncovering the underlying biology when there is that huge difference. But on the other hand, the really short-lived animals are the ones that we can take into the lab into a really reductionist environment and then answer those questions. But I think you're right, at a human level as well, there is more of a connection with longer-lived animals that have closer lifespans to us. Even our companion animals, our dogs and cats, are not as long-lived as we are, but certainly long-lived compared to other mammals their size.
I quite like this. I quite like this classification of the sensationalist or violent aspect of death. And going back to what you said about Victorian children's literature, where children were told that somebody just died. I work with Victorian fairy tales, and that is part of the appeal. I love how violent those fairy tales are, and they're not exactly as detailed, but that's where the charm lies. That suddenly somebody just died. Somebody will just die, or you get to know about a witch who was boiled in a pot of boiling oil, I think, something like that, who was drowned in a pot of boiling oil, and they're quite violent, and they're quite visual in the sense that with the way they're presented, even to children. And yet, when you have tales, for example, like Sleeping Beauty or Snow White, we do not say death. We just say they've gone into a deep sleep, or Snow White is not dead, but sleeping still, blah, blah, blah. And so we see how the language of death focuses more on metaphors than the actual terms. And how do you think this vocabulary that we use, shapes how we view not just death, but the whole process of dying and accompanying grief?
Even the euphemisms that we use for death are, so non-specific. Passing away, passing to where, to what, when. They're very non-specific, and it makes it perhaps easier to deal with something that's fairly scary to think about, death itself. I have to, in my day-to-day life, try to get rid of a lot of that and just be as specific as possible in thinking about death. But yeah, at least in a lot of the cultures that surround us here today, we don't like referring to death, and it feels rude sometimes to say somebody died.
That's right. I mean, I suppose one of the things that when I imagine, people thinking about engaging with my own work, but I suppose one of the things that takes some people aback is the directness or bluntness of the ways in which you end up sort of talking about these things. So I will give plenty of examples in my classroom where I simply say, yeah, at that point, the person is dead, 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 right? Period, right? No sort of qualification on it. But of course, that's a more sort of, I don't know, inquisitive or investigative sort of context. And I guess, of course, people like to point to these kind of euphemisms as evidence of a kind of discomfort or something like that around death. And I think there is a lot of discomfort around death. But the more sort of charitable or sympathetic side of me sort of also appreciates that, with respect to particular people, it's normal that, our accommodation to the fact of their death is going to be gradual in many cases, right? It's not always the case that people sort of transition from, believing, understanding that the person is alive to, okay, the person does die, and now they believe and understand fully that they're dead. But I think one of the things that rituals like funerals and so on serve is that they serve as kind of transition events, right, to enable people to come to the moment when they can simply say such and such is dead, right? And I think these euphemisms tend to sort of enjoy prominence in that phase where we're still sort of getting used to it, right? I mean, I think the people who matter to us most in our lives, it's difficult, right, to get used to the fact of their death, right? This seems to be one of the sort of really clear findings from almost everybody who investigates grief and bereavement, is that there's an aspect of it that involves kind of disbelief, right? Not literally, right? It's not that you don't know that the person in question has died, but that somehow it takes a while for this, if you will, to sink in, right, and sort of fully bore into our relationship to the world and to ourselves. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It seems to me it's quite a healthy sort of thing. And during that phase, we're probably not going to be as, I don't know, direct or as candid in the way that we talk about that.
I think that's a really good point to think about the difference between death biologically, which is an event, something that happens, versus the effect socially on everybody around the person who's died, which is a process. The death there is not one event and then it's over. Death is a process that takes time to go through, and grief will manifest for many years to come.
Still, perhaps I could try a contradiction here. So you began that little episode on the discourse by saying that funerals are rituals that help. Well, I was about 18 or something at school, quite shocked by the youngest master we had. Disappeared for a week, and when he came back, he said his nana died. So one reporter up. He thought funerals are the worst thing in the world. Just as the scab's beginning to form, it's ripped off again. And that made me think a lot, because I think what's not obvious about whether funerals are well designed is you can think about people of different degrees of relatedness. So the person most affected might really hate them and find it destructive. Others think it's appropriate to be respectful. But funerals are quite often held as a big party where people don't want to ignore the death, but actually they're glad to be alive and to see other people, and they're not having very much trouble. That doesn't mean it's not an important social occasion, but there's really very different things going on at this one thing.
Well, I think, again, going back to something I said earlier, I think we do have the yearning to be recognized as dying. I think if most of us reflect upon it, we'd probably want posthumously to be recognized as dead, right? And to have sort of everyone for whom it matters that we're dead, come to the consensus, if you will. Yes, in fact, he's dead. And we're now sort of treating him as such, and it's sort of, fully assimilated into our consciousness and our thought processes and so on. But of course, funerals are going to have different effects on different people. But when you talk to people who, find value in them, right? I think one of the things that they do find is, the opportunity to engage in the sorts of gestures and communications and so forth, right, that allow them to accommodate themselves to the fact of their death. I mean, people say it was my chance to say goodbye, right? Of course, this isn't true for everyone, and for some people, it's, as you say, a tortuous experience, because it's sort of like, I was already comfortable with the fact of their death, and now you're wheeling them out, and we all have to look at them and talk to them, as if they're around and so on, and it sort of seems farcical or something. So I agree with that possibility. But of course, that's just to say, right, for any given death, there will be innumerable different ways in which people relate to it. So,
And I think the rituals surrounding death go far beyond just a funeral. There's visitations to the grave, that even elephants do that on a ritual basis year after year. So there is something to not just having one event to mark a death, but having an ongoing ritual to remind yourself of the person and the fact that they are dead, acknowledging that that is a real fact of this person.
yeah, the dead don't leave in some sense. Right? I think that's an important thing to grasp, right? That, you know, going back again to maybe some of the ways in which, for the most part, I think we're probably different from most of our animal kindred, is that, you know, we keep the dead around, right? You know, I've got a little device in my coat here that has hundreds of pictures of people who are dead. So, you know, that's a sort of distinctly human sort of thing, and I think speaks to our high levels of sociability for one thing, but also just again our ability to explain and think about our lives, right, in richly cross-temporal terms, right? Here's who was, right? And of course, I've also got pictures in there of ultrasounds of people's babies that are yet to come. So, you know, who's going to come along too? So our sense of ourselves as being related, right, to past and future humans, I think is one of our, you know, clear defining features. An intergenerational sensibility.
Should we perhaps open it up to questions, comments?
Are you keeping the queue?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Perhaps you go first.
Yes.
Sorry.
I wanted to ask, there's a couple of observations that struck me, like you were talking about how you reminded us how religious interpretation of dying as a passing somewhere have been like declined. And then I remember from the first time we met how we talked about like the definition of that being not so clear, not talking about the heart, talking about the brain, and also like how our understanding of consciousness is still very limited. So I guess the question I want to ask is, even though there is all this growing interest in death, and most of us don't find satisfactory answer in the religions anymore, but on the other hand, the study of death in academia, things in academia are very fragmented and like silent. So my question is like, how does the study of death can help us put it into the larger context of human existence?
Well, I mean, you know, my discipline's a funny one, right? It I think owes something of its existence to the human struggle with death, right? So, you know, Plato puts in the mouth of Socrates, you know, philosophy is preparation for death. I've sometimes suggested to my partner colleagues, this would make a good slogan for recruiting students, don't you think? Somehow they don't go for that. So, I mean, in some sense, right, I think that the contemplation of our position in the world, right, and, you know, the duration of our lives and our relationship to other people and things, right, is, you know, in some sense, the heart of the philosophical enterprise, right? So, I mean, for philosophers, it's never not been on the agenda, right, to think about our relationship to our own mortality. I guess in terms of thinking about my own discipline's relationship to other disciplines, my work's relationship to other disciplines, I mean, obviously, you know, I think we're always looking for, you know, data in a sense, right? People sort of, you know, reported experience of how they relate to death, how they feel about it, what they seem to think about it, you know, ways in which I would say sort of sociological changes, scientific changes, technological changes alter, right, people's attitudes, right, and awareness of death. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's a healthy thing for philosophers like myself and for my discipline to kind of evolve side by side, right, with developments in other disciplines and to, you know, have them inform one another, right? I mean, I will admit to a certain frustration because sometimes I think the conversation is a little bit unidirectional and that maybe sometimes the philosophers should be listened to a little bit more. We've been thinking about this for a long time. In some ways, I think we're wrestling with the questions that other disciplines kind of have views on, but, you know, haven't really thought about all that carefully, right? I mean, just a very basic one, you know, it's a presumption among public health experts that we should try to prevent death. Why is that? Presumably because it's a bad thing. When I ask public health people how to defend that, they're like, I don't know, just isn't that just obvious? I don't know, a lot of people have thoughts on this, right? So, does your sort of whole discipline's methodology rest on, mistake possibly? So, I'm glad to see that kind of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary conversation, right? But I do think it's also important that all of the parties, have their ears wide open.
I think your point about how we sell our disciplines to students, to the world, is a really interesting one. I was designing a course once, and it had been running for a few years. It was going pretty well, but we weren't getting quite the student uptake that we expected. And the course title was about the biology of aging. And somebody suggested, well, wouldn't it be catchier if we talked about the biology of immortality? Isn't that something that would just draw more students in, but really made us step back and say, wait, is that what we're doing in this field? No, we are not talking about immortality. We're not talking about fighting death. We're talking about understanding aging so that we can promote health. But it was an interesting pivot where the language that we use does make a big difference. And how we define death, how we define aging, how we define all of these really influences the end goals for what it is that we're studying and doing. So I think death, as you said, from the first session here, is not something that's clearly defined in a lot of fields. And it's really important. So the better we can do that, the better prepared we'll be.
You could have said that was that course was the study and the control of immortality.
Maybe.
Well, because
I try to avoid the word immortality with what we're
There are some enthusiasts in your
there are,
field for
there are,
immortality,
yes.
So,
Yes.
Well, particularly because there are clearly mechanisms that shorten our lives. And the question is, why is that possible in biology? So I don't think that would be undermining your discipline. It would be forcing a different aspect that actually you should look at.
It's a good source for debate for students. I do think there was
If there was a question
another-
at the back.
yeah.
It's more of a statement, maybe a bit of a question. I'm an end-of-life care nurse, and so my job is also to talk about death a lot. And you're talking about the discourse of it, and the kind of bluntness, speaking about death and dying, acceptance of it, the denial of it, whatnot. And from my experience, I think I've noticed it definitely changes from person to person, family to family. So depending on the sugar household with and then because I'm in the community and not in hospitals, so it's less institutionalized, not institutionalized, less. So while you can have the very honest conversations going on in one room, family, of what's actually happening, not all of the conversations and the honest discourse is happening face to face with the patient, and at times when that is happening with the patient, it's not a person that's dying. Sometimes they do want to hear it, and other times don't. So it's like it is actually there's this kind of societal acceptance of or familial acceptance of what's happening, where there's a personal level as well. So I'm just wondering, I guess what I'm asking is, with the discourse and with the experience of death, and looking at it from its social experience, looking at it from a macro rather than a micro level, and how much personal side of it you would look into yourselves. Obviously, you were talking about the fruit flies, which I thought.
Yeah. I mean, even within something as reductive as fruit flies, we don't know how much variation there is in how a fruit fly reacts to death. Is that death terror thing that I described more prominent in some flies than others, and why? We don't even know that.
More neurotic.
So perhaps, yeah, they do have personality. They really do. But no, from a human perspective, I think the wide variety of responses to death and the diversity among humans, among social groups, is something that's wonderful, but also challenging when we're talking about something as important as death.
Right. I would just add that I think one of the challenges that people in your position face is that sort of every group, right, in which one of the members dies is its own kind of microculture, right? And when I talk to people who work in end-of-life care, I think many of them are very cognizant of the fact that you're dealing with people who have quite diverse belief systems related to death. I mean, dealing with a family that is concerned about the fate of the individual in the afterlife is rather different from the family that, has no such concern. And, my own feeling is that we're probably much better, right, in terms of like medical education, in terms of enabling clinicians to sort of be death sensitive in this way, but probably still have a bit of a ways to go.
Yeah, it's really interesting just seeing all the different levels and what you're talking about and just putting it into practice as well and thinking about where I'm going to take what you're talking about as well.
I think we had a question back and then.
Good evening. I'm coming from a position of someone who just experienced recently a loss of my mother. She actually passed away exactly 1 month ago. And my own experience of my mom's death was something that I myself was quite surprised. And I guess I'm coming from the position that before this happened, I was already, again, as not just as a nurse, but I was also a volunteer carer in a nursing home. And I've experienced already a lot of people experiencing death, like me coming one day and say, oh, your patient is no longer here. She already passed on and she already died, and we will have a new patient coming in. So my own lived experience of someone dying and someone who is about to die kind of conditioned me already to that experience of death. And so when it happened to the case of my mother last month, instead of actually feeling the pain of someone who is about to go, or at least someone who was left, it actually left me some feeling of what now? And I think I didn't realize that she really passed on, she really died until the day that after we buried her, when we started to work on the inheritance, when we started to work on some of the unfinished business of my mother, that I actually realized that my mother is already dead. That there's no one who will take care of finances, of legal documents, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we now, as the living survivors, have to take over and continue that unfinished business. So I think what I'm trying to just emphasize here is that, yes, it is the social experience of me getting exposed to the realities of death, but it's also collectively grieving together, because during the whole funeral and wake experience, I also didn't see how my mother was valuable until people come to me and say, this was my mother to them. And this was actually the missing piece in my own understanding of who my mother was. And then right after that, the other social and maybe human experience and maybe legalistic experience of death is when we start to talk about the documents as well. So I'm just kind of looking at it at a more systemic level now, rather than just experiencing that the first time and really nothing like, what am I to do here? But it's giving much more perspective now on the different faces, the different agencies, the different institutions that surrounds when a person is about to die, when the person is dead, and the post funeral things you have to do beyond that. Thank you.
I think that echoes a lot of what we've heard. That death is a process. Death is a long experience.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that your remarks underscore one of the most interesting philosophical questions about grief, right? So, we'll be here 2 hours. So if it's the typical 2 hours, something like 85,000 human beings will die in that 2 hours. Probably, right? None of you are going to grieve any of them in particular, right? Why not, right? Well, we grieve only people with whom we stand in a certain kind of relationship. And it seems like we only grieve those with whom we stand in a relationship that provides some of the elements of our own identity, right? Some of the elements of our own self-conception. So it's not uncommon, I think, for people to have the experiences along the lines that you report, where the death of someone else is in some sense a kind of identity crisis for the rest of us, right? Because as you put it, sort of what next, right? What do I do next, right? Or how do I act in a world where, in your case, your mother, I suppose, right, was a sort of anchor feature of your existence, right? It's like taking a landmark off your sort of mental map, right? You think the landmark's going to be there, and what do you know, it's not, and it takes a while, in some cases, maybe with the help of rituals and other institutional facts, for that to be fully assimilated into your self-conception. But I think one of the things that people tend not to appreciate or recognize about grieving is that there's a sense in which grieving will typically be transformative for us in this sense, right? We will come out at the end different from the way we came in because, you know, some aspect of ourselves is not with us anymore and we can't relate to it in the same way, right? And because we can't relate to it in the same way, it catalyzes changes in us.
Yeah, it's perhaps more of a comment rather than a question. As we were going through the discussion, I couldn't help it, but I kept thinking about rephrasing that to die alone, to live at the mercy of others, because I actually feel like we talked quite a lot about grief as a communal experience almost, but that only starts when the person has already died. And I feel like this is one of the tragic aspects of life, that sometimes we get to be reminded of the importance of someone only after they pass away. So obviously they're not there to become a witness of the collective grief oftentimes. And especially after COVID, you know, maybe some of our family members died alone in hospital. We couldn't say goodbye. With the wars happening right now, so many people died at the front line, perhaps alone or in terror and panic, not feeling supported or not necessarily feeling as part of a collective. And then obviously we grieve in occasions where we feel connected to those that have passed away, but there is also now this collective aspect of like we glorify those who have fought in a war and we actually identify with them as well because we can recognize the importance of what they did, and then they almost become like family members or extensions of ideals that we project onto that reality in some way. So I feel like what makes grief so fascinating to me is that actually you always die alone. And you hope to live at the mercy of others, perhaps, to actually build onto that beautiful end of life. But I feel like profoundly death is always a very lonely experience, and I feel like it unites the living more. But that still doesn't mean that the fact of dying kind of undermines life still.
You said a mouthful. Quite a lot of different things to focus on there. I mean, in terms of, you know, grief as a reaction to death, it is worth keeping in mind that sometimes people do grieve in anticipation of death, right? There's a phenomenon known as anticipatory grief, right? And that's an interesting phenomenon in its own right. As far as sort of dying alone, I mean, there's a way in which the philosopher in me sort of thinks that that amounts to a kind of equivocation. If you just mean, right, I can only die my own death, that's true, right? No one else can die for me or in my stead, right? But of course, it's not true that I have to die alone, right? There can be people around, right? No one else can die my death, but that's no more significant than the fact that, you know, no one else can have my headache, right? It's mine, right? So yeah, I mean, you're right, that there's a sense in which death is a solo experience, but I don't think it's the same as saying that death can be a lonely experience.
Maybe it depends if it's like acute death, or you suffered a stroke, for example, and you're hospitalized and then you die the next day and you don't get to see anyone. But also the last memories of your life are this case where you're not even sure if you have any recollection of what happened.
Well, I think circles us back to, you know, the conversation we were having earlier about, you know, why we do seem to, from a resources point of view, you know, prioritize, right, people's final days. I think we do have this sense that we want for ourselves our final days, weeks, hours to have a certain, you know, quality characteristic where one of them is not to sort of go out in this kind of confused, you know, muddled, right? My guess is probably many people do go out in a confused muddle anyway, but nevertheless, maybe, you know, there's more or less confusion. Maybe you can do better or worse.
I think the point that you made about anticipatory grieving is also really important in some specific contexts. I've been fortunate enough to interact with the Alzheimer's Society for some of my work that's been funded by them. And in a lot of the cases where I've talked to families who had a loved one who lived with dementia and died with dementia, they talk about this grieving and often grieving the person as if they died long before they've actually died, because the person they knew in their eyes is not the same. So I do think that grieving happens on both sides of death and can be, it's a process that can draw people together, but then it does also bring in that question about coming together around a death and how to add value to that for everybody.
I've heard the phrase social death applied to parting with someone demented long before they're physically dead.
The question here, so referring to what you said about quality, of that period before dying relate with it because I have my grandpa passed away in 2017, where my family is trying all they can to keep him alive, spending maybe millions of R&D to just save him, but he was really suffering in the end. And while my dad passed away a few months after, alone at home, like nobody was there. And I think it just I feel it's related with some sense of selfishness a little. Whether we as a family want to keep this person or respecting this person will of death versus someone choose to die so quickly that maybe the people around them would get hurt or feel more pain. And so I have a question, because in Switzerland now they have this program, people can choose to die, and how does it could what is your perception?
Well, I mean, if you want to know my perception of this, go to the website pcads.org. I'm a member of a consortium that advocates for the legalization of assisted dying. So my perception of what's going on in Switzerland is that it's probably a good thing. In terms of why it's a good thing, I think you put your finger on one aspect of it, which is that I think for many people, the experience of death is an experience of a great deal of powerlessness, right? Because, again, death nowadays tends to be a highly medicalized experience. So it's an experience where a sense of dependency, right, prevails, right? That people are injecting you with stuff and doing all these things to keep you alive, keep you comfortable, whatever it might be. And I think one of the things that assisted dying can provide for people is the prospect of transforming something that will feel very powerless into something that they are able to exert some measure of control over, right? So, we know, for example, in places where assisted dying has been legal for a long time, like in Oregon, a significant number of the people who are given prescriptions for the medication that you're given in Oregon don't use it, right? It sort of stays on the shelf, right? And they're kind of keeping it there, maybe because possibly they want to do it, right? Not because they're necessarily resolved to, right? But I think, in terms of our relationship to dying people, I don't know if any of you know Atul Gawande, his book Being Mortal that came out a few years back. I had the privilege of meeting him, and one of the things that we fell into conversation about over dinner was, how families make decisions, right, medical decisions about end of life and dying people. And one of the things he said to me was that, a lot of people are making decisions about end of life because they're trying desperately to love this person, and they don't know how to do it because they're not in a position to be easily loved. Right? Yeah. And they're trying very hard to figure out how to do that. And so the way they think that they might try to do that in some cases is to try to give them all the resources that can possibly be given that might extend their lives, treat their illness, etc. It's a kind of gesture of grand generosity or something like that, in a situation where they too feel some measure of helplessness and powerlessness over this person, and this person may be becoming less and less I'm not sure what the right word, but amenable to being loved, sort of available to being loved in the standard sorts of ways. And people feel sad because they can't love them anymore. And they're trying very hard to figure out how to do that in a context where it's just damn difficult. I think that that's understandable, but probably leads to a lot of suffering on all sides of the equation, honestly.
I think her question ties really well with this idea of assisted dying in euthanasia, now that she's brought it up, along the blurred lines of life and death, and what you were saying before about medical treatments prolonging and delaying life, but it's actually just delaying death. So do you think in that case, assisted dying then gives you some power over this whole process where you're not just delaying death because you're helpless, you can't do anything in that period?
Yeah, well, I think by definition, a medication for assisted dying is not one that prolongs life, which is why I think from a medical perspective, it's so challenging because so much of our medical system is built on this idea that we should be using medications to prolong life and that there's a value to the amount of life, or at least a perception that there is a value to that. But I really hear what you're saying, and I think that it's going to take a rethinking and reframing of what medications are for to be able to think about that more clearly.
Yeah, I would say that typically in medicine, our ethics are about 30 years behind our technologies, right? And they tend to play catch up. And I think we're just now kind of having this conversation about, what are the goals of medicine, right? Is the extension of life, the central, most fundamental goal at the expense of any and all else? And I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. And in some ways, right, it's a conversation that kind of lags behind the technological reality that we can do things that, keep people, from a biological or physiological perspective alive, right, almost indefinitely, right? And if they are, at death's door, we can intervene with artificial respiration and so forth that will, at least extend the physiological processes associated with life. So, I think we're always behind, right, in terms of our adaptations to the technologies that we create. No, I mean, euthanasia has been going on, for thousands of years in different parts of the world, but I think it's become more salient only because, right, again, of some of the things that kind of we kicked off our conversation with tonight, where death is, or dying is this more prolonged process, and it's just going to be a more galvanizing, sort of possibility when dying is more like a kind of slow and steady decline of physiological function, which it is now.
I just had a question from you, right? But from
me? Yeah, from you.
Okay. So I think I'm going to ramble a bit, but there's a question in there. And I think it ties into talking about the healthcare system. So I think my research interest lies in looking at the experience of death and dying in acute hospital settings, and especially how staff experience that. So most people die in acute settings, but acute settings are designed to make people better enough so that they can go home. And I think staff who go into this field carry those values quite close to their heart of that, yeah, it's my job to make someone feel better, and I will always look at what else I can do and not necessarily stop and recognize when actually there's not much else to do, and we should think about how to support that transition. And I guess I'm curious about then how we reconcile those values, healthcare staff, with concepts like assisted dying or palliative care, and are we then as medicine improves, are we forgetting that when to stop? So yeah, not rambling.
Well, I mean, I think, we've been saying much the same thing around the issue of the relationship between, I guess, the sort of the values that inform medicine and the technologies that are available, right? I think we're still in the period where many medical professionals, not all, but many, right, are going to define success, right, as medical professionals in terms of longevity, right? And, I would say that there's no easy way to get people to rethink this other than to encourage a model of medical education that, doesn't think of longevity as, the be all end all of the provision of care, right? But I do think that, one of the great things that the hospice movement has done, right, is, to create a sector, right, within, broadly speaking, healthcare, of professionals who say, yeah, our values are not, rooted, right, in the metric that longevity, right, trumps all, right? But as you rightly point out, that seems to be fairly common, right, in the acute care setting, right? And it's an understandable failing, but I would still describe it as a failing, right? If sort of the self-conception or self-worth, right, of the clinician is so closely bound to longevity in this way. I mean, so like nobody's got a magic wand to change these values. So, but I think we know what the right direction to head in.
And I think science has been and continues to be particularly bad at this. Not to be too glib, but scientists are very good about thinking about whether we can do something, and then we don't think about whether we should do something. That's a famous scientist once said in the film.
I've been involved with this subject for about 12 years. Started a group called Dialogue, D-I-E-A-L-O-G, which we published a book a few years ago called Living or Dying, which includes a range of subjects. I have one particular question about it. It includes things like digital legacy, funerals, living wills, all the works. But one of the chapters is on looking at the psychedelics and how psychedelics reduces people's fear of dying. There's been quite a lot of research into that in America, in fact. And I'm just curious about what your position is with regard to psychedelics and death.
I don't know they have a position. I guess I would say that based on what I know about people's reports about the psychedelic experience and how this alters their attitudes toward death and mortality, it's understandable why it might reduce anxiety or fear around death. I think when we think about fear of death, the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what precisely are we afraid of? Right? Are we afraid of some posthumous condition we might imagine ourselves being in, the afterlife, something like that? Are we afraid of sort of non-existence, right? Sort of just the fact of no longer being the subjectivity that counts as me. I think one of the things that we're afraid of, right, is our losing all of the ties to things and people around us with which we might commune and relate. Okay. And I'm not an expert on the psychedelia experience, but it seems to me that what many people report is that it can involve a sense of the connectedness, right, to things outside of oneself without loss of self.
Right. I think it could be quite well linked to the assisted dying issue as well, because it's going to be legal in this country probably fairly soon, already on the Isle of Man. It's almost legal, and it's going through the Parliament, Scottish Parliament at the moment. And I think looking at psychedelics and its link to assisted dying would be an interesting topic to look at.
Yeah, I don't know that people have exactly made that connection, but again, I think that the psychedelic experience, you can understand why it would assuage, right, I think this anxiety that is rooted in the sense of being kind of evaluatively disconnected from everything else, right? Because that's one way to kind of see the I don't know, the great tragedy of death, right? Is that nothing can matter to us, the dead, anymore. And we like the world to matter to us.
Just to return to this idea of anticipatory grief, I think a lot of grieving, especially anticipatory grieving, comes from this kind of idea that the person is no longer themselves. But I feel that that's kind of maybe a selfish way to look at it. Not that the person is no longer themselves, but they're no longer useful in the way that they were. For example, someone with dementia who can't recognize their own family, who can't give the kind of like love and affirmation to people around them that they could when they were healthy. People talk about that, well, they died a year ago when they forgot who they were. And it's like, but that person can clearly be happy. They can clearly express that they are joyful and they can have needs. So with this idea of anticipatory grief, I kind of wonder how much of it is almost an innate thing to us. It's like, well, they are, they form my identity. I no longer recognize them as that. Therefore, I am going to feel these emotions of grief. But how much of it is kind of conditioned by a kind of positivist culture of our use to society is what makes us alive, what makes us valuable. Just to like frame this like really quickly a little bit, my interests are representation of death in games. And I think when a game character dies, especially one that you control, it is not death because the character never existed. It is that character can no longer be used by you, and they lose their kind of like value for what they can do and how they can enable the player to interact with the world. So yeah, that's kind of my very long way around to the question. Is anticipatory grief something which is a kind of innate within us as humans, or is it a product of a positivist society?
Well, I'm going to go with the first. I mean, I think, you know, if you accept that what prompts grief, okay, is the fact that death necessitates an alteration or a relationship with someone. I can't relate to the dead in the way that I can relate to them. I continue to relate to them. They can still matter to me. I can recall them. They can be influential in my life, right? All sorts of things like that. If you accept that picture, right, then of course, if you happen to know, right, that death is nigh, right, then of course you might start entertaining, right, or becoming aware, right, of the likely alteration in your relationship with this individual that will be necessitated by their imminent death. Okay. Now, I think, you know, there's nothing incoherent about grieving fictional characters, for example, right? Now, of course, grieving them is interesting because, of course, we can't really grieve them for the losses that death represent to them. They were never alive, right? Actually, alive people, there's this further kind of feature of grieving that we can perhaps, that some of our grief is oriented around the loss that the dead perhaps have suffered through death. So I'm not sure that I think it's related to sort of like the moral or instrumental value of a person, right? I mean, it's often been noted, right, that people grieve the deaths of people with whom they have absolutely atrocious, terrible relationships, right? Who are arguably not only not useful, but if you will, positively injurious. I think that's because what we grieve for, right, is in some sense the part that they played, again, in this sort of map of our own conception of our relationship to the wider world. And sometimes some of the people that are on that map maybe aren't that great, but we grieve them nevertheless.
I still feel though, even if they're on that map, even if to you they were nothing but misery, I think what you gain from that is part of what you are grieving. So I suppose grief is a selfish feeling in that it is about how you are feeling. And
I'd say it's egocentric. I wouldn't describe it as selfish.
I suppose that's what I meant.
I wouldn't describe it as selfish.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything selfish about trying to reconcile yourself to the fact of a person's death, if that person really did, right, play the central role in your identity.
Yeah. I also think we just can't really conceive of death, kind of being death as, well, maybe conceive of an afterlife, but I don't know if we can conceive of just the complete unknowability of what death is.
Well, that's a contentious claim, right? Plenty of people have thought that they do know what occurs to us subsequent to death.
Yeah, but I think their claims can't be substantiated.
I think we'd have a good philosophical argument.
Oh, right, okay. Well, maybe not
Just to go back quickly to anticipatory grief, I do hear what you're saying, and I think that is the experience of many people who are grieving somebody who is not yet dead, but has changed in such a way that they are no longer the same person. But I do think I am fortunate I've not had close personal experience living with somebody with dementia, but the people who I've talked to who have do talk about the ways that that person still brings life to the room. The person through singing, through music, through not remembering who people are, but being able to remember the songs from their childhoods or remember the taste of something that was really in their favorite food. That is still something that does bring life, but of course there's still grieving there for the other parts of them that are no longer the same. I've not gotten the sense that it is a grief for the loss of something utilitarian, but more grieving something that will never be the same again.
Is there something from a biological perspective around maybe just answering the question of what it made me think about certain ways? If you think about reciprocal altruism and doing something for someone at the expense of yourself, you know, we see it in primates, we see it in ourselves and just think about our attachments, and of course we want to belong. But I just wonder if there's something about that, and I wondered if you might be able to speak to that. But just it made me think back to that reciprocal altruism when you said that memory was misery. What if that was hard for people? But part of that grieving process is doing something for someone else at the expense of ourselves, but we are innately wired in a way to do that. So that's a completely normal response. I think a really valid question to put out.
Yeah, I mean, from a purely biological perspective, just thinking about simple animals, the reciprocal altruism is certainly a behavior that many animals exhibit for other animals that are closely related to them. And the more closely they're related, the stronger that behavior usually is. The strongest reciprocal altruism occurs in eusocial insects or eusocial animals, where all of the individuals, ants, bees, wasps that live in a colony are extremely closely related to each other, or sometimes genetically identical, depending on the species. So there, death becomes very difficult to understand, because when an ant worker dies, but the very closely related ants around it survive, that death is actually promoting the genes that are surviving because of that. Humans obviously are much more complicated and don't have that same genetic structure, but it's very possible that those same biological underpinnings are there in humans as well.
Just a 5-second comment about grief. I just wanted to say that I also think that there are stages of grief, and at least based on the death of my own father and grandparents, I feel like in the beginning, in the acute stages of grief, you do grieve the person more, like he could not be there to live more, to see more, to experience more. And then after a while it becomes, why did that happen to me? How am I going to deal with the mortgage that I inherited, or having to live without a father? So I also think that there are stages of grief, and grief does change over time. You know, you grieve the loss of your dad after a decade in a very different way compared to in the immediate aftermath. And I think that I wouldn't say that it's selfish from that point of view, but based on my own experience, I definitely feel like my grief was a lot more selfless in the first years after my dad passed away. Actually, it was really about him, and then it became more about the practicalities of living without a father. Actually, that's of course anecdotal, but just based on experience.
I think it was someone at the back. Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Can you elaborate more on the distinction between prolonged life and promoted health of old age? Do you see these as two opposing ideas, or is their relationship more intricate?
Yeah, this is a really common question, and a really good question that comes up in my field. A lot of the work that we've done has been to use simple animals to try to look at just lifespan and see if we can extend lifespan, with the underpinning assumption that an animal that's living longer will be healthier. That doesn't always ring true. In fact, it's maybe not even the majority of the time is that true. So I think as a field, we are evolving to now think more about measures of health, which is much more difficult to figure out what a healthy fruit fly looks like versus an unhealthy one in the last few weeks of their lifespan. But I think it's really important. And in my own work, I found some examples of genes that can extend lifespan, but the flies don't look like they're healthier. They don't act younger. They don't have stronger muscles. They just live longer. But there are other things that make the flies have stronger muscles when they're older, end up having behavior patterns that look more like young flies, but they die at the same time. So the question is, which of those are we going to take forward and think about things we want to pass on to the next researchers along the way to eventually make a difference? And I hope that the field is moving more towards thinking about health during aging rather than just lifespan. But it's a shift that is yet to fully happen.
I think all the things we're talking about, you know, in terms of how much longevity has increased, you know, in the past, you know, century or thereabouts, right? I mean, the problems that we've been grappling with tonight in this conversation are sort of unintended byproducts of quite understandable medical research programs, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to try to figure out how to, you know, help people live longer, right? But I don't think that, you know, there was, you know, and for good reason, you know, foreknowledge of the ways in which, you know, this could also involve, you know, larger proportions of people's lives perhaps not having the kind of quality that they might hope for, right? And again, we haven't extended, right, proportionally, right, the health span proportionate to the lifespan, right? We can get people to 85, 90 years, right, much more easily than we could in the past. But they still tend to have, 75-ish years of good health, right? And whether that's better or worse, I mean, I think there's an interesting kind of question there. But I think it's important not to kind of, be unsympathetic, right, to the medical research program that's got us to the point where I mean, in other words, this is a good problem to have. People living a long time, right? It's a sort of problem, right? That you might sort of say, great, right? Sometime around 1900, we started to grasp the microbial origins of most infectious diseases, and so we figure out how to get people out of infancy into adulthood, and hooray for that, right? So I don't want to sort of be casting those who put us in this position in a negative light, right? These are byproducts of success.
I have a question around like notion of pain of death, personal notion of pain of death, because this question goes with, say, for example, a patient is suffering for a lot of chronic illness. Nowadays, we see people, since they live longer, they practically live like a zombie towards the end of their life. So some people say that I want to die rather than live like this. And there are cases in which mental health is very bad and people commit suicide because the pain of mental health is much more than what they feel a death would be. But again, we see examples of like people taking psychedelics and they are like, okay, now my stamina for this pain, accepting this pain has gone through. So like, how does a person perceive, what is the sociological reasoning behind like how people perceive death and then compare it to their circumstances?
It's a huge question. I mean, there's a huge literature on the sociology of life. I mean, that you can consult. I guess I'll just pick up one thread in what you were saying about pain. I think in general we tend to overestimate the importance that people assign to physical pain, right? Not to say that people like it, right, or that they welcome it, or they want more of it, or something like that. But I think one remarkable feature of human beings is that we can endure, right, a fair amount of physical pain, and will endure a fair amount of physical pain in the context of a life that we judge to be good in other ways, right? So, again, going back again to the question of assisted dying, when we look at, the research on people who opt for this, it's surprising how little or how rarely or infrequently they cite physical pain as a reason for wanting to access assisted dying, right? And this isn't to say they're not in physical pain. It's just not as high a priority as you would anticipate, right? What does seem to be motivating them? The sense that their medical conditions preclude them from enjoying the goods of life, right? It's not the presence of the bads of pain, but the absence of the goods of life that seems to be more powerful motivator for many people, right? I mean, I don't know how many know Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He was, I suppose, one of the first people to make this point, but many people have made it subsequently, that people will put up with all kinds of crap, right, if they have some sort of expectation that they continue to live in a meaningful way. But when you don't have the expectation that you can live in a meaningful way, that's when it seems like people more seriously contemplate wanting to hasten death.
Things are related on the back of that. Would you argue or promote for a larger portion of our educational experience to be about our mortality?
Yeah, we should go back to the Victorian tales. I mean, I think so. I mean, it's a hard thing, right? Because there's also no way to do this in a neutralist way, right? Because people have conflicting opinions about the fate of ourselves after death, and whether human suffering is ennobling or terrible, and so forth. But it's got to be education that's focused around organizing a discourse, organizing an inquiry, rather than giving people presumably authoritative answers in the way that we might did math or science or something like that. But I mean, I'm far from the first person to observe that children seem to actually have a greater degree of comfort talking about death than many adults do. in part because they haven't yet been acculturated into, some of the taboos and sorts of norms, right, that we've been talking about tonight. So sure, yes.
Yeah, even within the sciences, I think that we could do much more to talk about mortality, talk about death. It's skirted over. I remember one of my first classes that was shared with medical students when I was a PhD student. It was about the neurology controlling survival, the very basis levels of what keeps our heart beating, what keeps us breathing. And the professor turned to one of the budding young clinicians and said, "So how would you tell me if this patient is dead?" And it was a really good question because there is a set of diagnostic tools for figuring out, but that has evolved with time. It's not so clear. It's something that we still have to define. And even medical students aren't always taught about it. The student was taken aback, most of the class was. It's not something they had been taught. So I think even in sciences, we could be much more clear about what is death. Let's not skirt around it. Let's not try to talk about life instead of death. It's an important part of it.
And I would say, going back to your question there earlier about, acute care, so, I think one of the elements here should be encouraging, right, in clinicians, right, of the attitude that death does not represent clinical failure. It's a fact of human existence. It can be delayed to some extent, but not indefinitely, right? So, it need not represent, right, a failure of clinical provision. It can, of course, it does happen, unfortunately, but, it need.
Can I ask your opinion? So we know there's a lot of things with fitness, nutrition, and lifestyle that can help us live longer, healthier. But why are people so reluctant to do it?
That's next month's panel on nutrition. I don't know. Why are people reluctant to do it? I don't know. People are irrational in any number of ways.
But this comes up a lot because it's, in my field, the easiest way to make an animal live longer is a healthy diet, exercise, things like that. But that's not what the medical research councils want to hear, because uptake won't be that great when you turn around to patients and say, this is the diet you need to follow. Even things like caloric restriction, which is one of the things that we know can extend lifespan in animals. You don't want to turn around to people and say, just eat 40% less. People aren't going to do it. Our basis survival instinct is to eat so that we can continue living and continue functioning at the full level. So it's just really hard to get people to do that. There is a nuance to that, of course. Eating a healthier diet doesn't have to mean severe restriction. It can mean a much more balanced diet. And healthcare systems, unfortunately, are not well designed right now to do that sort of preventive care, rather than the reactionary care of medicalizing things and having medications for them. Ideally, we need both.
Yeah, let me say one thing here. I think some people have a healthy aversion to healthism. Okay, where what I mean by this is that there is a sort of personality type, right, that is willing, right, to monitor their bodies, right, and what goes in it, and what is done to it, and so forth, in the pursuit of longevity, health, whatever the presumed objective might be. But I think there are also people who look upon that and say, I don't think it's good for the quality of my life to be constantly self-monitoring everything that I do. It's, if you will, the inverse of hypochondria. Right? It does seem to me there's some wisdom, right, in the person who comes to have, right, this I suppose would be the ideal, who comes to have, if you will, healthy habits, right, rather than, if you will, a kind of preoccupation, right, with the pursuit of health and longevity. Because it's that preoccupation that is arguably not very good for our well-being. So the idea of control over our own physiology is, I think, kind of an illusion.
Even though it's being done.
Sorry?
If you look at blueprint and what Brian Johnson's doing, he's obviously very controversial, but that's what Brian Johnson is doing now with the Blueprint project,
right,
where the slogan is really "Don't die"
right,
in the next century. I'm highly skeptical of this, but essentially the idea is that each organ has an individual age, and you can control the age of the rate.
Even if he's right, it doesn't strike me necessarily as a good way.
No, I would never think like that. No.
In other words, I think that I think is one reason is that it is, if you will, a healthy reaction to not wanting, right, or not thinking it is itself desirable to try to exert, right, this measure of authority over one's physiology.
I think there are both good scientific and good ethical reasons to remain skeptical. As
Yeah.
you are.
You're also polite. Because some people have our meaning of life is closely associated with food and pleasure. And who cares about a bicycle?
No, I think that's another thing to be said too, right? Is that, you know, the person with the self-monitoring healthist orientation, right? Everything that is in their environment is, you know, evaluated based on its, you know, toxicity or nutritionality, right? I mean, you know, I'm not saying that people should be indifferent to their health. On the other hand, you know, I think recognizing the danger of going much further than that, than is probably wise, is not necessarily a stupid idea either. And also the gains may not be that great. I mean, you're more expert than this than I am, but I mean, you know.
It's like you don't like exercise.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's something to that, but I mean, also, you know, aside, I mean, like smoking's a big one, right? Like you know, the longevity gaps on smoking are really big, right? But like even, you know, you read these things, Mediterranean diet and these other kinds of things, you know, like the differences are like, you know, 4 years between Mediterranean diet and conventional European, right? So, right? And you're like, okay.
But we've spent a lot of tonight saying that it's not the years that should matter.
Well,
It should
that
be the
too.
health
It's not the years
outcomes.
that should matter, but you also might sort of ask, you know, okay, I'll die later. How much later? Right? You know, how and how good will those years be, and that sort of thing. Yeah. Right. So, you know, sometimes I think that the energy exerted is sort of disproportionate to the likely benefit in terms of lifestyle. Right. I mean, alcohol is another one, right? So, you know, you look at the alcohol consumption, you know, statistics. It's like, yeah, you know, you drink 2 drinks a day. This increases your chance of getting this or that cancer by 0.86% over people who don't. And I'm like, does anybody care? I mean, does any, you know, like, why would anybody be too preoccupied with that? Right. So, you know, at some point we're talking about management of very small differences in risk.
Somebody's done the research.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody's done the research. And good that they have.
Right. How do you reckon with the longevity research done, what is it called, Aging Well with Harvard? And you probably looked at that research, which went for about 70 years. It's still going on.
Can you speak about a bit more about which project you're referring to?
The original one was, I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book called Aging Well. And then there's been 2 more books that have come out since then. But they're all long-term studies on aging. And I'm just wondering how that might relate to your research, particularly.
I have to say I don't want to say the wrong thing because I don't know exactly which study you're referring to.
Right.
But if you find it, I could certainly talk about it.
Well, what I'm referring to is they name a whole lot of factors that promote longevity, not longevity, but promote aging well, or whatever age you die at. But and it's certainly not just about diet or alcohol and things like this. It's about all sorts of other factors. And that's the study I'm referring to.
Okay. Yeah, well, absolutely. It's not just individual factors. There's a lot more to a life than what you eat or what you drink.
And the bequest on the part of your parents to your, you know, genetic heritage has something to do with it too.
Yes, please. You've been raising your hand sometimes.
We're talking about like statistics like kind of almost functionality or like what you know positive society is. I feel like I receive the most anticipated I see most in patients that have lost their function or their meaning, as in like how they have thought they were meaningful in society and their purpose to other people. And you know, when they're in their homes and they're not able to leave their homes anymore. And I just think that and you're also saying about how to kind of marry that idea of making people more well with the idea of like assisted dying, etc. And you know, in the acute sector, you get the idea when you're making people better and then they go home. And so it's that instance you leave the hospital and then they're out of sight, and then they go home and then they're in their homes and they're maybe not functioning that well. And I think that we live in a society where healthy aging is directly related to how well people are going to function for themselves and for other people. I think there's no way to discount that. but I think when it comes to the idea of like assisted dying, we maybe need to like turn it into a discourse of assisted living, like rather than dying, because I think that when we talk about support and what support people need, then that opens up a whole relaxation activities, you know, where we can actually speak about dying and living in the same context, like, so that it's not just a case of like taking a swallow of a pill to end your life. It's about what can we do to make your life better, you know. So it's like a whole different discourse altogether, and I think that's a bit happening. But we have the NHS, which probably the other ones, so that's where the difficulty is. But I just think that that's the important things to acknowledge is that, you know, functionality is a huge part of living, really. And it sounds quite cynical, but it's true.
Yeah, I mean, when you read what clinicians who've been involved in assisted dying in different parts of the world say about it, right? They believe, and I think they're probably right about this, that the availability of assisted dying is a discourse change, right? Because it allows a kind of candor, right, around this possibility, right, that is otherwise unavailable. Okay, and one of the things I like to emphasize to people is that if, for example, right, assisted dying were legalized here in Scotland, this would not be the beginning of assisted dying in Scotland. Assisted dying is taking place in Scotland right now, right? I mean, every jurisdiction we've ever studied tells us that it occurs, right? So the question is not whether it occurs, but whether you want it to sort of be open to public view, regulable, that sort of thing, right? But I think one of the salutary effects in places like Oregon, California, in the United States has been that this forces or kind of conversation about an option that has actually always been an option, just not legal. So our choice is not between no assisted dying and legal assisted dying. It's between unlawful assisted dying and lawful assisted dying.
Same with drugs.
Same with drugs. That's right.
And same with abortion.
I mean, the fact that people will go to Switzerland and pay a very high fee, right, to do this, right, is indication that there is a kind of, I don't know, unquenchable, but sort of, not entirely satiable, right, desire for this.
A difficult choice. I just think it's like we should be thinking about how to make people have more meaning in their lives.
Agreed. Agreed.
Yeah, like,
Agreed.
yeah.
Right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up here. But please feel free to approach each other or approach our speakers if they're willing to stay behind a bit more. Thank you all so much for your engagement and questions. And a huge thank you to Nathan and Michael for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.